Welcome to the Weekly Wars podcast, where two guys who talk about Star Wars way too much have decided to record it and let you listen. Be sure to check every Wednesday to get the latest episode. And now to Zach and Rhett.
What I was saying by that.
You can start.
Welcome to Weekly Wars, your weekly dose of all things Star Wars.
I'm Zach.
And I'm Rhett.
I guess you usually start it anyways, huh?
Yeah.
And you end it. Why do you get both of those?
Because I'm cooler.
I didn't even notice.
Well, that's
It's
your
totally
own
unfair.
fault. You have done that yourself.
We're on 15 episodes, and I just barely noticed that you pretty much do all of the openings and closing.
I thought this was 14.
No, this is episode 15.
What? Don't you lie to me.
No, I'm serious.
I don't even believe you.
Okay.
I'm verifying for myself right now with the power of technology.
I am a fact-based person. Did you find out I was right?
I don't believe it.
It is as true that we are on episode 15 as it is that ObiWan is the worst Jedi in the galaxy.
See, that contradicts what you just said.
Does it?
Because one of those is absolutely false.
So you're saying we're not on episode 15. That's what you're saying. Okay, we are officially on episode 16 of Weekly Wars. We're skipping 15.
Yeah, right. You couldn't do that.
To this week, we are talking about how to make the prequels better.
Which is a very broad topic.
and to be fair, I think there's a lot of different ways you could go about it, but we have some of our own ideas and that we've talked about.
Well, and it should probably be mentioned, it might not make them better overall. We definitely think that it would make it a better movie, easier to be watched by general audiences. But these are also just ideas that we have had and talked about that would make them more fun for us, more specifically.
Probably. That's true. It also depends on, I mean, the movies might have been okay as is with a couple more revisions and a different director, just because George seems to have lost his touch, unfortunately. But, like, the whole romance scenes. I even think this is worth mentioning. J.J. Abrams talked about how even in Force Awakens in the new movie, the relationship between Finn and Rey wasn't really clicking. And he actually was very grateful that Harrison Ford got injured while shooting because they wrapped up filming for a few weeks to let him get taken care of. I don't remember exactly how long it was. It was a month or two, I think.
Right.
And that let him sort of rethink how he was going to handle their relationship. And then Finn and Rey worked out a lot better. So that was sort of a blessing in disguise, although I guess Harrison Ford is like suing now, or his agents are suing and blah, blah, blah.
All that weirdness.
But the relationship ended up working. So, maybe with the right director or just the right amount of time, the romance between Anakin and Padme might not have been so effing terrible.
Well, I guess we can just jump into that part right away.
Is that what we want to talk about first?
Well, that's what you brought up first. So, yes, I think one of the downfalls of those romances, or that singular romance, those romance scenes, is just the fact that so much time was spent on it. I mean, it's like...
And what's hilarious is that there are deleted scenes with more
right.
of the romance stuff.
Yeah, like they developed Han and Leia's romance with literally a quarter of screen time. A quarter of the screen time.
And it was way more believable and accepted by general audiences.
Right. And so I think that is probably one of the biggest areas that they could have adjusted that to make it better. Quote unquote, because it's completely subjective, but it's just, you don't need to show everything. You show little things and you show like small interactions and things like that. You don't need to have Anakin immediately come off as a creepy stalker dude.
Right. Going into episode 2, because they meet each other in episode 1 and he kind of hits on her, which is really weird. But they're both grown up in episode 2.
He in
where
episode 1, he just barely found out what girls are, so he's just hitting on everything. He's like, oh, you're a girl and you're not a hut? You must be an angel because you're not ugly.
It's the first human girl he's seen. Like,
that wasn't that old lady that told him to run for shelter because she could feel a storm in her bones. That's the only other female that he's had contact with besides his mom.
Well, anyway, so in episode 2, they're all like, Obi-Wan's going to have his adventure, and Anakin and Padme are just going to go hang out and have romantic times together. Like, that's the plot.
That's what we went to Star Wars for, was a rom-com, obviously.
Right.
Him pretending to be hurt was a huge selling point of that movie for me.
Him falling off of that animal and rolling in the hay or whatever, and she gets on top of him.
Those preposterous animals that just have giant rear ends.
And then he goes and meets her family, for heaven's sake, and we don't see that in the movie. That's one of those deleted scenes, but he actually goes and meets her family, and you're just like, what is this?
Right.
Like,
and is that a way to stay undercover too? Like,
right.
I don't know. I mean, romance aside for a second, I guess, like, that's one of those, not that Star Wars is kind of full of those terrible ideas of like, hey, we'll just hide this person with their family. No one ever looks for the family.
Right.
Like, she can go live with the mom. Luke will go live with the uncle. That's totally fine.
It's fine. If Vader ever found out there were children, this is not the first place he would send people to check. Obviously. So this is kind of how I would go about that relationship. First of all, I don't think Anakin should have been a tiny little kid in episode 1. I'm not totally opposed to that idea, but the way they went about it, I don't think worked. I think he should have been an adult in episode 1. And he's sort of a Jedi with a mysterious past, but all the Jedi know who he is. And they sort of are wary about him, but they also have known him to have done amazing things. So he kind of has this backstory behind him, and other Jedi sort of revere him or are scared of him, but he's genuinely a good guy.
So and I think that kind of goes into one of the points that I had typed up, just to present the idea, kind of what the Clone Wars started to do, which we do want to do an episode on, how the Clone Wars specifically improve the prequels. The
Clone Wars cartoon.
Yes, sorry. The Clone Wars animated TV show. The way that they present it in the Clone Wars, which they should have brought into the movies, was him as a good guy, right? And in some cases, the only, like, compassionate and kind of what's that word I'm looking for? Like he's like a hero of the people, right? Like most Jedi and even Obi-Wan Kenobi are all about like the greater good and being removed from the world and aloof and much more meditative and I guess Zen like, where Anakin is all about the people. He forms relationships with the clone troopers. So if they had brought that in, like made him a person, a Jedi of the people, he goes out and interacts with people. He's about defending them. He's about all that. That could set up, for one, the dichotomy of the Jedi. And like we've mentioned before, you can show the arrogance on the one side because some Jedi think that they shouldn't have to be doing that, right? Like they're more concerned with spiritual matters, so they don't have to deal with those worldly
He even could
things.
be a little more aggressive in terms of military combat, which is
Absolutely.
fine, but it works out early on.
Right.
Like he's like, no, we're going to be aggressive, but he saves people, right? He goes in and saves slaves, and people are like, well, the Jedi really shouldn't be, killing slavers or getting involved in those affairs.
Right.
Well, yeah, but Anakin just saved a whole bunch of slaves.
Yeah, he made thousands or millions of lives better.
Right. Yeah, which sort of ties into my next point. So you take episode 1. I don't have a problem with Naboo. I don't like the name Naboo, but I don't mind the planet. I even don't mind Gungans if they weren't stupid.
Gungans, besides Jar Jar, aren't the worst. Like
they aren't the worst. They do spit
there's
randomly.
there's other aliens that are just as preposterous, But yeah, Jar Jar just took that to a different level.
So I'm not totally opposed to that, but so have an invasion on their planet, have the people just holding the planet and putting the Naboo people into slavery, because they talk about that in episode 1, but we don't see it. They say they're suffering, they're in camps, they arrest Padme and they say we need to take Padme to this camp with the other slavers, but we don't see any of that.
Well,
we see like the pilots of Naboo, and that's pretty much it.
Right. That is funny, because one of the points that I brought up was that they tried to explain too much, but obviously in not all areas. And that's
right.
that Naboo invasion situation is probably the one place where they should have shown a little more, and they didn't, because instead they want to show us what Tatooine was like, 20 or 30 years or whatever before.
And it is Star Wars, so maybe they want to travel to other planets. And I don't know how they'd figure that, but have Padme on Naboo suffering with her people.
Right.
Let us see that, so that you start to feel for them and get an emotional connection with the character, instead of a super bland, like, I swear she was directed to sound as bland as possible. If you go and listen to it, she is literally trying to sound as bland as possible. And maybe that's so that everyone confuses her with her handmaidens, so that it's easier for them to switch in and out for protection reasons.
She is a politician.
And she's a politician. Have you listened to Trump or Hillary talk? But have her in there suffering, and then, like we're talking about with Anakin, this hero comes to save the day, and Anakin and Padme fight for the freedom of the people together, and that's where they get their bond.
So I did have an interesting thought during your previous idea, and again with this. It seems like it would have been a very interesting approach if Phantom Menace, they had just swapped out a couple of characters. Instead of ObiWan, the young Padawan who's still learning could have been Anakin.
Yeah.
And maybe even Qui-Gon Jinn still could have been there. This is just pre-Obi-Wan becoming master to Anakin, right? And I feel like that could have been a fun way to take it, because Obi-Wan still could have been like a respected Jedi Knight at that point, right? Like, he could have been established, well-known, well-liked, fast-tracked to the council because he'd been trained by Qui-Gon, and that could have given him and Anakin that bond. So when Qui-Gon does die, because I'm okay with the general concept of Qui-Gon dying as a motivation, and maybe that could be an indication in this hypothetical movie of mine of the dark side of Anakin's path, because maybe they do go off and do the heroic thing, but it gets Qui-Gon killed. And then Obi-Wan's brought in to finish Anakin's training.
Well, and maybe that's when you see the first moment of Anakin's doubt, is when he does this heroic thing, but Qui-Gon dies.
That could fire his resolve, temper his resolve to be even more resolute in his heroicness, and he becomes more and more heroic, more and more powerful, until eventually Palpatine comes in and uses that heroism and that resolution to bring him to the dark side and show him the Jedi aren't doing what you want to do. You know what's best for people. I will help you with that.
If you were stronger, you could have saved Qui-Gon.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That type of stuff.
And then you can also, with that type of storyline, you let the romance happen naturally. He's involved with Padme because he's there trying to liberate her people. They both share similar ideals. I mean, and they address this in the movie through boring dialogue where they have these similar ideas. They just have different ways that they want to approach this. They could have shown us all that by having Anakin actively fighting and aggressively negotiating these peaceful terms with different groups throughout the trilogy, while she's always enforcing diplomacy.
Right.
So
which creates a fun, love-hate relationship?
Right.
I don't
they're
know.
at odds sometimes. Then they like make up, and then they get married, and then they're at odds because now they're married, but they still have different ideals. It's like a real relationship.
I've never heard of such a thing. Han and Leia's was a blissful romance. They never fought once.
They loved each other from first sight, obviously.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Well, that was kind of a huge merge of one of mine and one of yours.
Several ideas just converging.
Do you want to start on one of your next ones?
Yeah, so this is an idea that I actually just came up with recently, on making the basis behind this idea, which is essentially making the final fights more significant, has gone back to discussions Zach and I have had for probably years at this point. But basically, like, the end fights, Yoda versus Palpatine, ObiWan versus Anakin, just don't make sense. And it's not like there's some momentous things that happen, but there really should have been a lot more momentousness. And I think Zach actually had the idea several years ago that he told me of making Vader's reveal wait until Sidious and Yoda are fighting. Yoda goes to confront Sidious. They're duking it out. Maybe they're almost equal in power, right? They're both extremely strong in the Force.
Right, they're going back and forth. One can't overcome the other, but it lets you know that they're both really powerful, and this is a big deal battle.
And then Vader comes in, and Vader tips it wildly into the balance of the dark side. Yoda's
and you would feel like Yoda is awesome because have him hold off Sidious and Vader for a time.
Yeah, he survives. He's able to survive long enough to escape, and maybe like even have him like withstanding multiple Force barrages and whatnot, and then he gets away, and then it's like Yoda's still hardcore and awesome.
He's still awesome. He didn't run away for basically no reason.
Right. So it's like you could have saved Yoda's dignity as being a master of the Force and Grand Master of the Jedi Council, and you could have also brought up the level of Sidious, and that would have made that final fight between Luke and Sidious and Vader much more poignant.
Oh, yeah.
For Luke to withstand both of them would have just been mind-blowing after seeing
and how symbolic
Yoda.
Would that have been too, like, to make connections? Like, George Lucas seemed to pick the most random things to tie together,
right.
Whereas this, like, no, this is something you can set up that directly relates or symbolizes the final.
Yoda confronted the two when they were unified in purpose. Luke confronted them when they were becoming divided because of Luke, mostly.
Right.
And then Luke capitalizes on that advantage, and that's how he wins, right? And so also going into that backtracking fights a little bit to the fight where the three Jedi Masters and Mace Windu go to confront Palpatine, which is one of the most... I don't know. It's just a travesty.
Randomly dumb moments in the movie.
Right.
Like
just
when
for
it happens.
No reason. There's no reason.
You're seeing it happen. You're like, oh, there's like 4 Jedi Masters coming to get him. This is going to be an awesome fight.
Right.
Like, yeah.
And then no. And what? So that part's just terrible. I think what could have made that just significantly better would have been to have Palpatine use some sort of Force power to defeat them. And I think one of the best options for that Force power would have been from the Knights of the Old Republic 2 video game. You could have pulled from Darth Nihilus's suite of powers, right? Because in that, like, he sucks the life out of entire planets, right? He's strong enough to destroy a planet just by absorbing its energy through the dark side. So you could have had something similar with Palpatine. These Jedi Masters show up. He just draws their life straight out of their bodies. But Mace Windu's able to resist it because, according to expanded universe and canon and fandom, Mace Windu utilizes the dark side as part of his deal,
part of his
right?
lightsaber style, and it's like that's who he is. Yeah, he's sort of
he's
on the brink of the dark side at any particular moment.
Right. He doesn't suppress anger and fear. He utilizes them in combat, and he utilizes them to strengthen his connection to the Force. So he's flirting with the dark side, and that gives him the ability to survive Palpatine's attack long enough to engage him. They can have their fight then, and it just would have lent, again, power to the given power to this guy that goes on to rule an entire galaxy.
Well, it would have been interesting for them to come into the room and surround him instead of just standing at that doorway. And then you just see them like starting to shake and sort of look at themselves, and they're just like, what is happening? And then their skin starts shriveling or whatever. And the movie was PG-13 anyways. They totally could have gotten a little...
Right. You've seen worse things in
right
other movies. I mean...
And they're just like... And Mace Windu's like holding it off with his power or whatever. But you're all like, that's much better than just them standing there while they get cut down like dumbheads.
Right. They don't even try to defend. They just get... killed. They're slaughtered.
Especially Kit Fisto. Like, make him hold out a little longer at least. Give him a nod to the fact that he's a master and is supposed to be cool.
Right.
Like, golly gee. But I think in general that applies where the fights, they need to spend a little more time making them mean something. And I think that's a really good point that you have. Like, all the fights just... If you look at the lightsaber fights in episodes 5 and 6, they meant something.
There's
and 4,
so
like
much
Obi-Wan
emotion.
versus Vader. I mean, it's the worst choreography, but at least it meant something, Especially after seeing 1, 2, and 3, you're all like, oh man, after all this time, and Obi-Wan's willing to sacrifice himself. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen episode 4. It meant something. And then Luke versus Vader in episode 5 and Luke versus Vader in episode 6, like, it really meant something. So if they could have spent more time on that, I think that would have been huge.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing in the prequels that matches, in my mind, that matches the emotion of Luke versus Vader in Return of the Jedi. That is one of the most impactful sword fights in cinema history.
It gives me goosebumps no matter how many times I've seen it.
Exactly.
Because it's a culmination of so much.
Right. And literally good and evil writing on the line.
And that cinematography and the lighting they did for that, oh my gosh.
It's just amazing.
Genius. Golly.
So yeah, it's just unfortunate that they didn't capture that feeling again.
So I want to spend a little time talking about good villains, because I don't know where George Lucas lost this, but one of the great things about episodes 4 through 6 is recurring villains. I mean, Darth Vader, obviously.
Right.
The Emperor shows up first in 5. You don't actually meet him, but
just the hologram. Yeah.
Right, but at least it sets him up, and then you meet him in episode 6. You have Boba Fett.
Well, and they do mention the Emperor in A New Hope.
Yes, they do.
So they establish the presence, they show a presence, and then they show him.
Right.
It's a solid progression.
And there is a consistent villain in the Emperor, but he's not played off as well, and it's not obviously the bad guy, right? And the villain that should carry it, like Count Dooku, shows up at the end of episode 2 and then dies at the beginning of episode 3, which is so random.
Right.
Like, that's not...
Especially for an actor like Christopher Lee. That was just vastly underutilized.
That was terrible. And then, if you haven't seen anything else, Grievous just shows up in episode 3 and is suddenly running the entire army. And you're all like, something changed drastically.
Right.
Like,
Where did this guy come from?
And then he dies not like before the third act. basically.
halfway through the movie.
Halfway through the movie. Like, what? And Darth Maul dies in the first movie. So anyways, my thing is get a consistent villain. And I think the way to do it is have Darth Maul be that consistent villain. Have him go ahead and lose in episode 1, but have him come back as Grievous in the next episode. He falls down the pit. He was all messed up. But they take what remains of his body and put him in this robotic outfit. And that way you're all like, oh, that's kind of crazy. He's like back for revenge.
Right.
And so if Qui-Gon doesn't die in episode 1, have him die in episode 2 when Grievous / Darth Maul comes back for revenge.
Right.
And then when he eventually gets defeated, his body or his robotic suit, whether you explain this in the movie or if it's just implied or canon or whatever, that's the technology they eventually use to make Darth Vader's suit. So that it actually like carries through and connects him to the next villain who takes over.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It would have been a logical progression in terms of like technology of the films, but also just killing off a villain every movie or 2 villains a movie just doesn't give you anyone to hate long enough. Like,
no, and killing him way too quickly. Like Dooku, when he showed up and they're like, Count Dooku, and they use both of his names too, because don't they say Darth Tyrannus and Count Dooku?
Right.
And I think as a viewer, you're like, who the crap are they? And I know for a fact there's a ton of people who had no idea who Darth Tyrannus is to this day.
Yeah.
They have no idea, but it is Count Dooku.
Yeah, it's pretty sad.
I really don't know what that was all about. I don't know what he was thinking. Yeah.
Well, I think that actually ties into my next point, which is the fact that he wanted to explain too much, right? He wanted to delve too much.
Kind of what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Just there's too much that wanted to be explored. He wanted to show us the entire galaxy when we don't need to see the entire galaxy. And I
just kind of an example could be like where is it Grand Moff Tarkin or Vader, or is it the Emperor? I don't even remember now. Who says that the Senate's dispersed and the local systems will be kept in fear? It's Tarkin. Yeah. Okay. But we don't have to see the Senate. We don't even have to see the session.
Right. Well, and just my favorite is the scene of Luke in Obi-Wan's house. They throw out a whole bunch of terms that's like the first time you watch it, you're just like, I don't even know what the devil they were just talking about.
Jedi, Clone Wars.
Right. They talk about being Jedi. They talk about being a pilot on a spice freighter. They talk about Clone Wars. And it's just like, where is all this coming from? It's coming from the world that you don't need to see. You know, there's spice freighters. You don't need to know what it is. So like you
feel the world is lived in, but you don't have to have every little detail explained to you.
Right. And they just tried to explain all of those details with the prequels. So I think that's where...
Including the Force.
Right. Yeah, the Force had to have a biological / physical explanation, which it really did not.
No, it was no one needed that explanation.
Yeah. No, everyone was okay with what Yoda said. It was all encompassing. And what Obi-Wan said. I mean, it's just you could have just left it there. There are some things that should not have been explained, and we just need to be okay with that, right? And obviously that's a difficult line to walk because, like you were saying with the Naboo invasion thing, sometimes you do need to explain things, and that is one of the tricks of being a good storyteller, is explaining what you need to explain to continue the story while leaving everything else out. And I just, with the prequels, it was too far on the one end of that spectrum. And then Force Awakens kind of brought it back.
They're shoving it in your face and telling you they're in love.
Right.
Like they're going into way too much detail about that whole relationship, and you're all like, no, we don't need to hear any of this garbage, and we don't believe it.
Yeah. It's not being sold very well. But yeah, I think The Force Awakens did bring that back. It kind of reopened the world, right? And it's one of those weird like dichotomies where the more you're shown of something, the smaller that world gets, right? The more you learn about like a book series, the smaller it gets. But the less you know, the bigger it is. Like when you first watch Star Wars, you're like, this world is giant. And I think that the Force Awakens did a good job of reopening the world, because they went in and they were totally not afraid to just be like, nope, these are completely different planets, different systems. Everything's different, right? Hosnian system.
Yeah, in fact, they don't, and we've talked about this before, but they don't explain the Resistance and the Republic and the Empire and the First Order in detail.
Right.
What's important is the good guys and the bad guys.
You have good guys, you have bad guys.
And here we go.
Right. They need something. The good guys don't want them to get that because they need it. That's all you need to know. Anything more than that would have taken it into the realm of the prequels, because we don't need to see the politics. We don't need to see the Senate chamber in the Hosnian system,
which I think is funny,
about.
Because some people they say, I didn't understand all of that, like it's a complaint, and I'm all like, you want a scene from the prequels, basically.
Right. That's what you're asking for.
That's what you're asking for. You're asking for them to have them come and walk down a hallway, a really long green screen hallway, and have a very long conversation about well, the Republic is this, and they are this, and this is happening, and now we're going to go to this blah, blah, blah. No.
That is the prequels. That was too much information. That's not what we need. That takes it... I think that those types of stories could be explored in Star Wars standalone films in the future with that expectation. But you don't go to watch a Star Wars movie to see political machinations, right? It's just not what you want. At least it's not what I want.
It's not what I want. I'm interested in that stuff. I'm interested in reading about it in my own time, but I don't want that to be in the movie.
Yeah.
I want the movie to be fun. I don't mind breaks, and I do think that that's one thing that Force Awakens didn't have very much of. Those moments like in episode 4 or 5 when they're in the Falcon waiting for traveling. I felt like there could have been a little more of that. They do have some small ones, but I would rather they err on the side of exciting and fast-paced as opposed to err on the side of sitting around talking the whole time, or standing in a room talking, or sitting and talking, or walking down a hallway and talking, or talking at the opera, or...
a space water opera, okay?
The space water opera.
No, it is true. And like with Attack of the Clones being the prime example, Obi-Wan's doing adventure investigative things while Anakin's doing nothing. Like, that's too many breaks, right? And so, again, Force Awakens taking a dissimilar approach. They went without breaks. And I think that worked out much better for the movie than Attack of the Clones taking too many.
Agreed. Speaking of, like, making fights more significant, things like that, I think whether you take my idea of Grievous being Maul incarnate or not, they should have made him as awesome in the movies as he was in the cartoon.
Absolutely.
And I'm talking about the original cartoon. He's okay in the Clone Wars 3D animated cartoon, but in the original 2D cartoon that they made, it's a bunch of 5-minute segments. It ended up being about an hour and a half. But they just have this scene with Grievous where he has Jedi trapped in this little cave, and they are scared to death, and he is murdering them. And it is awesome.
It's brutal, and it's terrifying.
And Kiadi-Mundi is there, and... oh, dang. There's that Torgruda master that's there. I can remember her species. I can't remember her name.
Shakti
is there.
I got you.
Yeah. There's a Jedi
The
who gets
Whipped.
his head crushed, and it's like a Padawan, isn't it? That gets his head crushed.
It's Kiadi-Mundi's Padawan, I think.
Kiadi-Mundi's Padawan. Yeah. And Grievous has this cave surrounded by droids, and he tells him to stop firing, and he goes in and handles all of these Jedi single-handedly. And he's crawling around and sneaking in the shadows. Oh my gosh.
Is really funny because that is essentially what he does with Obi-Wan. But it just doesn't work with that because Obi-Wan
just instantly kills him, and it's kind of random.
Well, and I guess from the point of view of Obi-Wan, it doesn't make sense because he just jumped down in the middle of them. Like, he might have known that would have happened, but
right.
You know, it would have been interesting to do that same scenario with Revenge of the Sith, where Grievous tracks Obi-Wan down with the entire army and then says, "Don't fire, let's do this." And then Obi-Wan could have conquered him that way.
After you see him kill and you see him pull out all those lightsabers of Jedi he's killed in the movie, and you're all like, I wanted to see that. Like, I want to see that.
Which brings up...
that would have made him an actual bad guy.
Right. This isn't fixing the prequels or anything, but I do absolutely want to see a Star Wars movie just about Vader hunting down Jedi.
Oh, absolutely.
Bring that to me immediately. That would be so amazing.
Or if they made a TV series of that, I think that would be awesome.
Right. They could do that with Ahsoka. And Asajj Ventress. Anyways.
Man. But I still remember I was serving an LDS mission when episode 3 came out, and we weren't allowed to see movies. So I didn't see episode 3 until after. So it was about 9 months after it had come out. So all I knew is that people generally liked it. I ended up hating it. But they generally liked it. But I saw posters of Grievous, and I was just all like, this guy looks insane. And I saw the trailer where he's wielding all those lightsabers, and I thought, this is crazy. Then the first thing that you see him is he's a wheezing mess. And he's just kind of silly. And Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin aren't remotely scared of him. They don't care
never.
who he is. Like, they're even captured by him, and they're like, oh, it's fine. We're totally going to escape. Nothing's going to happen. We're fine. We got this under control. Like, make the villains scary. So this is sort of a side note with this. The droids. All of the droids should have been the bigger, meaner droids, and they never should have said anything. They should have just been really scary droid armies.
I do find that super interesting because it's like, if you're talking about that in terms of economics, did they really save that much money with inferior droids that could be beaten by sneezing at them too hard? Like, they're made of toothpicks.
And they're dumb. Like, I'm pretty sure I could just walk up to the droid and be all like, no, I'm the good guy. I'm helping you. And they'd be all like, oh, okay.
Right. Like, obviously, it seems like the effectiveness of the droids is completely outweighed by the cheapness of them. Or the ineffectiveness is outweighed by the cheapness. And if they had just made them all super battle droids, then they would have saved a lot of money because they wouldn't have been dying quite as easily. At least, I don't know. That's what it seems like to me.
Well, we're pushing our time. Do you want to add anything else?
More Qui-Gon Jinn.
More Qui-Gon Jinn. It was sad. It would have been nice if it had been better set up.
And it just could have expounded on, like, the different ideologies of the Jedi, right? Like, if he, everyone is talking about Qui-Gon being a gray Jedi, which I don't know if that's corroborated by anything canon. Like, he obviously had issues with the Jedi Council, but they could have approached that saying, like, yeah, he did have a different view. I mean, in certain sources, they talk about the difference between the cosmic force and the living force. Qui-Gon talks a lot about the living force, but they don't ever mention the cosmic force in the movies. So it's like they could have brought up that. Like, there is more to this than just the Force.
Right.
And
if you're going to
without
talk
going into
about the Force,
midichlorians-
forget the biological. Let's get more into these magical elements.
Right. Absolutely. And Qui-Gon would have been the perfect starting point for that, because he believes in the living Force. He thinks that, Jedi should be more compassionate or whatever.
Well, and that goes into our whole thing, too, that we've talked about, but we probably can't get into here, of the Jedi and their hubris being a part of their fall, and how that's not very well portrayed in the prequels. You could actually see that the Jedi aren't perfect, and that their views of the Force can change over time. Like, if Yoda and Obi-Wan had changed their views of the Force by the time they get to training Luke, it would make total sense based off of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yep, more Qui-Gon.
More Qui-Gon. There's other ideas we've talked about, but those are some of the ones that we've thought of that could just help overall have made them a little more fun, or a little more what fans were looking for, what we wanted.
Yeah, and we definitely might, or we definitely will revisit this topic at some point in the future. So if you guys have any suggestions yourselves, then feel free to let us know, and we can talk about those at a future time.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone. Join us next time. Be sure to share and subscribe and all that good stuff.
You do it. I'll let you.
And may the Force be ever in your favor.